When you picture a fortress, you kind of expect this rigid defiance.
Right.
Like you
Yeah.
imagine these massive, imposing walls of solid rock, a structure that essentially looks at the world and says, I will not move, no matter what you throw at me. And historically, that was the entire identity of the Earth Kingdom.
It really was.
Yeah, you either break yourself against that wall or, well, the wall eventually cracks. It is a very binary, violent kind of relationship. But what happens when a culture built on immovable stone decides to just let the walls fall?
That is the big question.
Right, because in this deep dive, we are exploring a really fascinating source document from the world of Avatar Soryuna. It details the Earth nations of the future era. And they didn't just redesign their cities, they basically re-engineered the human mind.
Yeah, it's a complete inversion of everything we thought we knew about their culture. We are looking at a philosophical landscape that took the very concept of immovable stone and transformed it into a masterclass on adapting to change. It's about how a society that was fundamentally obsessed with being the hardest substance imaginable learned the profound wisdom of listening before acting.
Which is such a wild shift for them. So, okay, let's unpack this, starting with the physical spaces themselves. Because, we all know Ba Sing Se's outer wall was like the ultimate symbol of isolationism.
Oh, the biggest in the world?
Right, the biggest city, completely impregnable, but totally rigid. The walls kept danger out, but they also kept truth out. So it is completely jarring to read that in this future era, they turned those imposing barriers into living structures.
Jarring, yes, but logically brilliant when you look at the actual mechanics of it. What's fascinating here is that the walls of Ba Sing Se were previously instruments of social control.
Literally dividing the classes into rings.
Exactly. But the earthbenders of Soryuna's era didn't just, blast the walls to rubble. They repurposed them. The outer wall became this massive living canvas covered in hanging gardens, public spaces, art studios.
Wow.
Yeah, they took the boundary and made it the absolute center of civic life.
I mean, I have to imagine that wasn't an easy transition, though, right? Because did they literally reshape the physical reins of the city to force the classes to mingle?
They did, yeah.
Because if the walls came down, the physical hierarchy of the upper, middle, and lower rings just collapses with it.
Yeah.
And people with a lot to lose usually fight the hardest to keep things static.
Oh, they absolutely fought it. The entrenched interests of the upper ring pushed back with incredible political and physical force. But the shift wasn't this violent overnight revolution.
Right, it wasn't a sudden war.
No, it was a tectonic shift. The lower and middle rings applied slow, sustained, unyielding pressure. Much like shifting continental plates, actually.
Oh, I like that comparison.
They just stopped maintaining the rigid divisions and started building connections across them instead. And over time, Ba Sing Se evolved into this messy, argumentative democracy. It became a global intellectual hub precisely because they learned to tolerate the friction of genuine disagreement.
Instead of just throwing up a wall to silence it.
Exactly.
Which brings us perfectly to Omashu, because they took that concept of, friction and turned it into a literal science.
Yeah.
Omashu was always a city of inventors, but this document details their philosophy of creative resistance.
Yes, creative resistance.
And the way they apply it to their civic engineering is just fascinating. They believe the most generative moments happen right at the meeting point between what an earthbender intends to do and what the stone naturally resists doing.
Right, because you think about traditional earthbending, it was always about forcing the rock to obey.
You punch, the rock flies.
Yeah. Exactly. But Omashu's engineers started feeling the grain of the stone. They realized that working with the internal resistance of the material, rather than overpowering it, produces a stronger, more complex structure. It essentially bridges the gap between engineering and philosophy.
It totally reminds me of trying to assemble a stubborn piece of flat-pack furniture.
Oh, how so?
Like if you just try to force a screw in at the wrong angle, you're going to strip the threading or crack the wood. Right?
Oh, yeah, you ruin the whole piece.
Exactly. But if you stop forcing it and you kind of feel where the friction is and adjust your angle, you are letting the material guide the tool.
That is a very practical way to look at it, yeah. You're letting the material participate in its own creation. And while Omashu was perfecting this with solid rock, the true extremes of this philosophy were happening on the edges of the continent.
Like with the sandbenders.
Right. If we look at the sandbenders of the Ceylon Desert, we see a culture that treats the desert as earth that has learned to let go.
I want to spend some time on that, actually, because the document gives them so much focus. And it is just a brilliant contrast. Sand is just rock. that has been pulverized by millions of years of wind.
Right.
So how does letting go actually function for them practically?
Oh,
Because
uh-huh.
managing a constantly shifting landscape seems like a nightmare for a culture that inherently craves stability.
Well, it requires a completely different physical and mental mechanism. To bend solid rock, an earthbender needs a very rigid stance, but sand is millions of individual particles.
You can't just punch it into shape.
No, you really can't. To bend it, the sandbenders develop this distributed consciousness. They don't try to lock the sand into a permanent shape, they guide its flow. Their philosophy of impermanence teaches that trying to hold on to a rigid form in a shifting environment will only get you buried.
Wow.
They thrive because they move with the dunes, not against them.
And you see a completely different but equally fascinating approach in the coastal cities. Because I always assumed earthbenders on the coast would just be constantly building seawalls, constantly fighting the ocean to keep it from reclaiming the land.
That would be the traditional approach, yes.
Right. But the text shows they actually adopted a receptive style, heavily influenced by the water tribes, actually.
They learned to harness the slow, erosive forces of salt and the tide. Instead of blasting out a harbor, coastal earthbenders might guide the tidal currents to slowly carve out a natural bay over decades.
Decades, just letting the water do the work.
Yes, they work with the water's natural rhythm. And what's fascinating here is that this is the stunning realization that unifies the continent. They finally understood that Earth isn't just a hard monolith.
It's fluid sand, it's receptive coastlines, and deep underground caves.
Nice.
But, okay, if the physical landscape is that diverse, and you are no longer governing these regions by brute force, how do you keep everything from just fracturing? It feels like you have to completely redefine what strength actually means to hold all these different philosophies together.
And that was their greatest philosophical leap. They had to redefine balance. In the past, the Earth Kingdom viewed balance as stasis.
Like a frozen scale.
Right, equal weights on each side, perfectly still. If nothing moves, nothing breaks. But the Storytime era realized true balance is dynamic. It's a living ecosystem where mountains, deserts, and forests all coexist, shift, and influence each other sustainably.
It's continuous change that doesn't destroy the conditions for life.
Exactly.
And surviving continuous change requires rethinking endurance. We tend to conflate endurance with stubbornness, right? But the text makes a really crucial distinction here. Stubbornness, which is refusing to adapt regardless of the changing environment, is what caused their historical stagnation.
Yes.
But genuine endurance, it is the capacity to be moved, to be weathered.
It's the mountain metaphor fully realized. A mountain doesn't just sit there untouched. It takes the rain, the wind, the ice. It loses boulders. It's carved into valleys.
It grieves its losses.
Yes, it grieves and feels the full weight of the storms. The mountain is fundamentally changed by the weather over geological time, yet it endures. That vulnerability is the core of their new strength.
Okay, wait, I want to push back on that a little bit. Because for an earthbender, strength has always literally been about gritting your teeth, adopting an immovable stance, and taking a boulder to the chest without flinching.
Right.
Are you saying they completely abandoned that physical imperviousness?
Well, they realize that imperviousness is a brittle kind of strength. If you are entirely rigid, the right amount of force will eventually shatter you.
Oh, that makes sense.
The foundational principle of this entire future era became listening before moving. Attention must come before intention.
Wow. Attention before intention.
Yes, the Earth already has the information you need. Its natural fault lines, its structural tendencies. Why exhaust yourself forcing your will upon it when you can just ask what the Earth wants to do first?
Which completely reframes how their bending arts evolved. Because if standard earthbending requires listening to natural fault lines, what happens when you look at something like metal bending?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Right, because the humans who forge metal essentially erase those natural fault lines. They refine the rock until it's synthetic. How do you listen to a material that has had nature pounded out of it?
That is the philosophical breakthrough of their metal bending. It's no longer just a combative trick to bend a door or a weapon. It's understood as finding the natural within the constructed.
The natural within the constructed.
The metal bender has to reach out with their senses and locate the elemental origins, the tiny, unrefined fragments of Earth still hiding within that manufactured product.
It bridges the imaginary gap between human industry and the natural world.
Exactly. It proves that no matter how much you refine something, its original nature is still in there, waiting to be acknowledged.
And that deep listening also evolved their seismic sense. We all know it started as a way to feel footsteps and track opponents.
Yeah.
But the advanced practitioners in this era, they aren't just feeling where you are, they are reading your emotional state.
Yes, they treat the human body like a geological structure.
It's wild.
The mechanics of it are extraordinary. Every emotion has a physical weight. Through the specific distribution of a person's footfalls, a master can sense the microcontractions in the muscles. They feel the heavy, dragging steps of grief.
Or, even more impressively, they can feel the specific rigid vibration of a body bracing against an unacknowledged truth.
Right.
Wait, really? So they can physically feel a lie?
Well, they feel the tension of a lie. The effort it takes a human being to hold back reality requires physical bracing, and that bracing transfers right into the ground.
That is terrifying.
It is. They can even feel the structural history of buildings where stress has accumulated in the stone over centuries, just waiting to snap. It's a full perceptual world built entirely from vibration.
Which brings us to the most dangerous evolution of all. Lava bending.
Oh, yes.
It is the rarest art, representing Earth at the ultimate threshold of transformation, solid becoming liquid, the permanent suddenly becoming terrifyingly temporary.
It's a very volatile state.
Honestly, I look at lava bending as the ultimate metaphor for being in the messy middle of your life. Like imagine a massive corporate reorg or a major career pivot where everything that used to be solid is suddenly fluid and hot, and you just have to stand in the heat without panicking.
I see where you're going with that, but the corporate metaphor might be a bit too safe for what lava bending actually represents.
Fair enough.
Because if you lose focus during a reorg, you might lose your job. If a lava bender loses focus in that liquid state, they are entirely consumed by the heat. A better comparison is the forging of a new sword from old scrap iron. You have to melt down the familiar, protective shape into something dangerously volatile just to pour it into a sharper mold.
Ah, so the stakes are survival, not just comfort.
Precisely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, lava benders are crucial in times of immense political and social upheaval because they possess a genuine comfort with that frightening threshold.
They know how to exist where an old form has dissolved, but the new form hasn't solidified yet.
Exactly. They understand that the liquid phase will eventually cool and resolve, and because they don't panic in the heat, they can guide the transition while the situation is still fluid.
They are literally practicing how to navigate chaos.
Yes.
And if these practitioners can read the structural history of a stone building or survive the fluid transitions of lava, how do they approach human healing? Because the document has this massive section on their medical arts, and instead of treating symptoms, they treat the human body as an internal landscape.
Healing in the Earth Nations is approached with the mindset of a geologist. They believe your body has its own compressed layers of experience,
Right.
and they address this through highly specialized practices like stone healing. And the mechanics of this are tied deeply to the physical properties of the Earth. For instance, they use dense, deep, black volcanic stones to treat a spirit that has drifted too far from its physical anchor.
So instead of using clinical terms, they view dissociation as a literal untethering.
Yes, exactly. They place these heavy volcanic stones on specific points of the body, using the literal gravity and dense resonance of the cooled lava to pull a floating, untethered consciousness back down into the physical weight of their limbs.
Wow. They re-anchor the person to the dirt.
They do.
And conversely, they use pale, translucent mountain stones to cure rigid thinking. The light physically refracts through the stone, and they use that scattered resonance to help break up stubborn, crystallized thought patterns.
It's a beautiful practice.
It really is. And they also develop these intense grounding practices, like breath work and specific weighted touch, for leaders and scholars who basically command their lives from the clouds, but have forgotten the feeling of dirt under their nails.
It's a vital practice for anyone functioning at a high level who has become disconnected from physical reality. But the healing goes much deeper than the individual's immediate lifetime.
Oh, the ancestral healing.
Right. They practice ancestral healing, which requires a staggering level of patience. They understand that generational patterns, like how a family responds to a threat or how they suppress grief, are laid down like compressed geological strata.
So what does this all mean for how they view trauma? Do they literally treat the human mind like an archaeological dig?
They do. The ancestors who experienced the original trauma might be gone, but the physical bracing they adopted was passed down, layered into the nervous systems of their descendants.
So it's still there in the body.
Yes. And it takes slow, deliberate geological patience to unearth those patterns without causing pain.
What happens if they don't unearth it? If a person just decides, to keep those layers buried and ignore the past?
Well, that touches on the culture's deepest, most fundamental understanding. Everything that is buried eventually surfaces.
Wow.
Whether it's ancient ruins exposed by centuries of wind, or suppressed history in a nation, or buried grief in a person, it will accumulate tectonic pressure until it finds an exit. The Earthbenders know that healing isn't about magically erasing the past. It's the deliberate, controlled management of what would otherwise explosively manage itself.
The deliberate management of what would otherwise explosively manage itself. That is incredibly profound. You either dig it up slowly
Mm,
or it erupts like a volcano.
exactly.
And you see that exact same patience reflected in their arts, too. We talked about Omashu's creative resistance in engineering, but their artists do it as well. Stone sculpture in this era isn't about taking a chisel and forcing a block of rock into a shape you sketched out beforehand.
No, the sculptor must listen to the stone. The goal is to chip away the excess to reveal the form the stone already wants to take, based on its internal veins and fault lines. It requires immense humility.
And working with clay takes that humility even further. Earthbenders who practice ceramics are forced to learn gentleness. Clay captures the lightest touch. It records even the physical impression of hesitation.
It
It
does.
teaches a culture historically obsessed with brute force that you cannot bully everything into submission. Some things will just collapse if you don't treat them with absolute responsive care.
And, we cannot discuss their arts without mentioning the massive stone orchestras in Ba Sing Se. They constructed these resonant slabs and towering columns that produced tones of incredible depth.
It's not just an auditory experience, right? The text describes it as a full-body event.
It's entirely built around vibration. The listeners feel the music deep in their bones and through the soles of their feet. It grounds the entire audience simultaneously.
That sounds amazing.
It all comes back to that central theme, feeling the ground beneath you, trusting that no matter how disorienting things get above the surface, the earth remains. And that history, those buried layers, aren't a burden that prevents movement, they are the solid ground you stand on, which makes movement possible.
This has been such a massive shift in perspective. If you are listening and walking away from this deep dive with anything today, let it be this. Resistance is not just an obstacle blocking your path. It is vital information.
Absolutely.
When you hit a wall, it's the material or the situation telling you something about its nature.
Slowness and patience are their own forms of intelligence, producing changes that actually endure the weather. And true strength isn't about never breaking. It's about having the capacity to let the world move you and choosing to continue anyway.
The slow work is the real work. The earth doesn't rush, yet everything is eventually accomplished. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much to you, the listener, for joining us on this exploration into the world of Soryuna. I hope you are walking away feeling a little more rooted and ready to navigate whatever fast-paced chaos the world throws at you next.
And this raises an important question to leave you with. If everything buried eventually surfaces and resistance is truly just information, what is the friction in your own life trying to tell you right now about the ground you're currently standing on? Are you taking the time to listen to the earth before you try to move it?